You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about positive solutions to environmental challenges. Solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe? How to plant a food forest? Restorative design or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned for Sustainable World Radio. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier. My guest today is Joseph Simcox. Joseph is a botanical explorer and renowned seed collector. Joseph educates about food plant resources around the globe. He's a teacher and lecturer, and Joseph inspires awareness and utilization of the global botanical diversity. Welcome to Sustainable World Radio, Joseph Simcox. It's so great to have you here today.
Thank you, Jill. I mean, you know that I love your work and especially getting the word out about all of these wonderful things that pertain to nature and our food and the future of humans living in their environment.
Well, we have a lot to talk about, and I feel like I would love to do a few of these interviews with you because looking at the list of lectures and talks that you have available to give on your website, which we'll talk about later, it's just you are a treasure trove of botanical knowledge.
It seems to be just an agglomeration of so many years of passion, so many years of immersing myself in a field. One of the things that we spoke about in the previous conversations that we've had, Jill, is the perspective of the generalist. And when people ask me, don't you have a particular group of plants or some field that you really want to specialize in? I have to tell them that the reason I am not a specialist is because I guess I'm still a child, because the whole world is intriguing to me, and to find how we immerse ourselves in this planet into nature opens up a huge frontier. It would seem that with everything having already been discovered, that it isn't so exciting. But what I find is there's so many people who have become specialists that very few people see the forest for the trees. And that's what I'm looking at, the entire forest. There's people who know each and every tree in the forest, but they aren't able to put the whole picture together. And this is something that's lacking in our modern world because we've necessarily been told that in order to be a real expert, you have to specialize, which seems rather counterintuitive when you have to consider all the parameters that make an environment and make a society and make a world.
So, Joseph, you have traveled to more than 100 countries. You've led over 300 expeditions. And can you tell our listeners what you're searching for, what you're doing out there, and why?
The inspiration is simply looking at humanity and trying to figure out how humans have lived all over the planet for thousands of years. We've lived in every conceivable environment, from the tundra to the mountaintops, to the valleys, to the deserts, to the jungles, to the savannas. And the question for me is, how did the human species create a synergy with nature so fine that it could survive in these environments? And so part of my discovery, part of the persuasion that I have for discovering is that I want to look at what humans used in the past to feed themselves. Now, certainly I focused upon the floral aspect, the plants that people have eaten. And in that, there's an extraordinary diversity. And that diversity, I believe, holds a key to the way we should live on the planet in the future. So from the past, an inspiration for the future. That's what motivates me.
I've heard you speak twice, which they've both been very enjoyable and very educational. And I just saw a talk that you did online at TEDx Aruba. And you mentioned being, I think the word was a retrovator. Is that the right word? Yeah. Can you explain what that means? It sounds like it kind of goes in line with what you were just saying.
Well, it is really cool to have a title. So this retrovator title actually was coined during a meeting that we had in Chicago. We had gone to this board meeting with the biochemists and the various chemists and engineers of a company called Mirasan. They are the producer of equal sweeteners. And what we wanted to introduce to them was a natural sweetener that we had discovered in Southeast Asia that promised an incredible revolution in the sweetening industry. but from a natural perspective. And so the people there were all interested in discerning and discovering what this sweet molecule was. And we sat there at the table and we said, no, we are not here to bring you a molecule that you can synthesize, a molecule from nature that your sole objective is to duplicate and replicate in a laboratory. But rather, we're here because we suggest that you should go back to nature. We're actually retrovators, going back to nature. And they thought that term was just sexy at the moment, and it stuck. And so since then, I've used it to discuss our work, going back to the past to come up with innovations for the future.
And so we are dependent. We're dependent on plants. And I love that term, by the way, but we're dependent on plants for our very existence, for food, shelter, oxygen, fiber, medicine, the list goes on. How do you, Joseph, you've been working with plants since you were a child, how do you foresee the human-plant relationship changing in the coming years?
Simply, the way we have lived in our societies has detached the regular, everyday human being from their source of existence. As you said, we all depend entirely upon the plant world for our survival. Without them, we don't have food. Without them, we do not have shelter. Without them, we don't have fuel. We simply need plants for survival. The fact that we've been able to organize our modern existence in such a fashion that there are supply chains does nothing to detach us from that necessity of relying on nature. It just has reorganized it. And that reorganization is, in a sense, a perversion of the human condition, because without people properly attached to nature, they don't have the comprehension of how significant it is to them. If we were to go to a great number of city dwellers and we were to ask them how important nature was, they may cite, well, it's great to be in the fresh air. They may cite that it's great to lay on the grass in Central Park. But the reality is they don't connect to the sustenance that keeps them alive. So most people then don't have an understanding of how dependent they are upon nature. And this ignorance is dangerous because we've allowed corporate entities, we've allowed governments to mandate our lifestyles without naturally connecting to what sustains us. And if more people learn about their need to depend on nature, it becomes evident then that we need to change the way we're living on this planet. And I'm not a doomsayer. I'm not a person who has the tendency to believe that we're rushing into hell in a basket.
Joseph, it sounds like you believe that we can get ourselves out of this current crisis that we're facing.
I believe, okay, first of all, after having been to over 100 countries on this planet, I consider such things as population mythology as being very detrimental to the state of mind of people all over the world. And you just heard me correctly. I've been to 100 countries. I've been to some very populous countries, some of the most populous being Bangladesh and India. And I've seen an incredible number of people living in relatively small spaces. One of the phenomena of this century, of the last couple centuries, is the megalopolis, where we have cities that number 10, 15, 20, even 30 million inhabitants. And these certainly are a way of showcasing all of the bad that can possibly happen as humanity converges on a single spot. All the pollution, all the destruction of the environment in the environs of these huge megalopoli. But the problem is much different when you consider the vast surfaces of the planet. What I see is the ability for humans to coexist with nature, to tend nature, and actually to proliferate nature. We don't take this into consideration much of the time because even in countries like Bangladesh that are reputed to be extremely overpopulated, from the vista of my mind, these are places that have huge potential. Part of the reasoning that I will present is that there's lots of labor, there's lots of people who can work, there's lots of people who can cultivate and tend the soil. If these people were properly armed with, a perspective about how they could coexist with nature, every single niche that is now a barren spot, that is now a useless spot, could be turned into something verdant and productive. And verdant and productive doesn't only mean producing food, but it also means producing beauty, because part of the human condition is the appreciation of beauty. I'm reminded a conversation I had many years ago in Mexico. I was driving down a country road with a then former art professor from Columbia who was actually Italian. And he was telling me in our conversation, I said, why don't they clean up the garbage along the side of the road? He simply said, Joe, they don't think that it is garbage. They don't even see it. And I kind of looked at him and I said, what do you mean by that? He said, it's education. He said, if you grew up in this place, you would just consider it normal for garbage to be laying on the ground. You wouldn't distinguish it from being beautiful or being ugly. It would just be there. And that is something that is very important to comprehend when we look at the world today, because from our psyches, say, people who live in urban areas in North America who are used to clean little streets and meticulously manicured lawns, when we go to a place like India and see piles and piles of garbage, our idea is this place has gone to hell in a basket because it's our comprehension. For them, it's just modern, everyday existence. Garbage is just a part of the scenery. So essentially, what we're needing to do is we need to educate those people to see garbage as what it is, a pollution to their environment. But it also tells us that we, with our manicured lawns, have to have the same education, but from a slightly different perspective, because manicured green lawns are no more synergistic with nature than the garbage laying on the streets when we consider all the things that we dump on our green lawns to maintain them green, and to what basic uselessness they have when it comes to living synergistically with the environment.
That is a good point.
It's a strange point when you think of it that way. So we look at megalopoly, these huge urban areas with all their pollution, as the main argument against overpopulation. But what I've come to conclude is that humans have the potential to transform the planet in such an amazing way as organic creatures that we can actually increase the productivity of the planet because of our numbers. And you just heard me say that. So all the people that you're listening to who are shouting overpopulation in the world and we're going to reach 9 billion, it comes down to the fact that what we do is more important than how many we are. And so this is very, very game-changing when you consider the future. I'll give you a couple examples. I used to look at the construction of suburbs with a great amount of chagrin. And it was something that I couldn't properly reconcile when we were building houses on some of the most fertile soil on the planet. For example, around Chicago, those beautiful black fields. The urban spread, the suburbs would spread into the farmland. And as these developments were created, they would eat up gorgeous black soil. So it was pretty depressing, but I was on a train going between Shanshui, Taiwan, and Taipei, and I had a revelation. I said, you know what? I'm taking this all wrong. I'm not being creative. Every time we build a human structure on the soil, we have the potential to actually be increasing the surface area of the planet. So why don't we use that extra surface area to produce even more greenery? So when taken in that perspective, we are increasing the surface area of the planet, and it's our lack of creativity that we aren't doing more with it. So if you consider a 10-foot by 10-foot plot that you construct a 10-foot high square building on, you've actually increased the surface area of the planet by 400 square feet. So if you were to assiduously plant the sides of your structure with plants, you could have increased the productive area that you can work with by 4 times. Now that's pretty amazing, isn't it? So this is one way of being creative, and this is one way of looking at the future. When I look at cities, yes, we have cities which have become efficient in a certain sense, that we can move around rapidly in cars and that we have infrastructure in place. But what will that look like 10, 20, 50 years from now if we start reconciling our need to live within nature within cities? Will we completely transform our cities where parks are not just isolated environs where people go play with their kids and their dogs and their cats? Rather, it will be a part of the ambient total of where we live. So we turn our living environments into something synergistic with nature. What if we start devising water systems where all of our gray water is now released back into the environment close to us and then filtered with the proper use of plants, gravels, aggregates, and ecological systems that make sense so that we're actually doing better to our environment? It will also take a certain amount of structuring of the way we use chemicals, the way we use detergents, the way we use soaps in our cleaning environments. All of this will have to be reconsidered, but eventually I contend we're going to find that balance point, that homeostasis, where we're actually living in nature as natural creatures. To just point out how absurd the idea of overpopulation is, nobody in my experience has ever come up to me and say there are too many ants in the world. Oh, potentially someone would say they have ants in their house and they hate ants. You'll hear that there's too many pests in a certain field or something, but no one has really gone out on the limb and said there are too many ants on the planet. Now, granted, they're much smaller than human beings, but they're also very, very labor intensive, and they do a lot of construction in their own ways. But what they differ from us in is that they live synergistically with nature, whereas we do not. They're a huge megalopoly of ants that just seem to fit right in with nature, and human beings don't do the same thing. So part of our inspiration then should come from ants on how they live with nature, and that will propel us forward for our own future. So in this little thought, I'm saying maintain our appreciation for modern comforts, but at the same time find ways to use those modern comforts to reintegrate us into a natural environment. Just imagine what that could mean. We've seen it over the last 40 years. Lake Erie used to be at a flashpoint where it would catch a fire on occasion because there were so many pollutants and so many combustibles floating on its surface. Over the years, we've cleaned up some of those things, at least visually, such that it's now teeming with fish again. Well, we can do that on a much grander scale, and we can do that with all of our environments. And so part of my inspiration then, going back to what fuels me and propels my passion, is to understand that using useful plants will, in a certain sense, inspire people quicker than just plants. Yes, plants are beautiful, plants are green, plants are this, but what if you can enjoy them and eat them as well, or use them for medicines, or use them for tinctures? It's that particular perspective that I consider when I'm going out looking for all these plants, because then I have a history, a story, and, if you will, a sales pitch to convince others why they should be interested, because they can see a practical application to their life.
And that is part of the population debate, is that we are using so many resources and we're destroying natural areas for agriculture. So it sounds like you contend that if we could change the way that we take care of our needs, and including our food needs, that we could live with 9 billion people on the planet and still sustain ourselves in a
Exactly.
more than survivalist way.
Yeah, think of it this way. When you're talking about the perspective that we're basically being presented with about overpopulation, it seems like a one-way system. And I'll try to describe it in this fashion. It's like the food comes in, it enters the human being, and then somehow whatever goes out the other end disappears into oblivion. And it's just like these consumers, they're consuming, and on the other end, you know where the other end is, it just disappears. But if you think about it as a closed loop, it doesn't really affect things in the same way, because we have the potential to take the food that we eat and turn it into extraordinary riches, even enriching the soils that we live on. Now, night soil happens to be, in many parts of the world, a de facto part of life, and it has been for thousands of years. Indian farmers use night soil, and we kind of stand back in abhorrence of the thought, because who would want to use human feces to fertilize your plants? Well, it isn't just using human feces to fertilize your plants. It's understanding the entire natural loop, the entire cycle. Considerations of hygiene are easily abated when you take into modern compositions of compost. You can kill all the pathogens by properly composting night soil, and there's no problem of reusing it. And the other residual effects of human inhabitation, all the debris of the plant life that we produce, turns right back into the soil. So we are actually like giant enrichers. We should see ourselves no different than earthworms. And that's the big nonsense that's going on, is that we're not looking at ourselves as natural beings. We're looking at ourselves as something above nature. As soon as we realize that we're in nature, the whole thing changes perspective. So that's why little Joe doesn't have the same doomsday perspective of population as so many people, because I say in a certain sense, it's just a human phobia, and it gives people a reason to shout and to scream without really considering who they are. What do you think of that challenge? Human earthworms. I mean, everyone loves earthworms. Don't we want to put more of them in the soil? Why don't we become the new earthworms of the planet and really make it rich and wonderful? We have the substrate to do so. So I'm completely an optimist about this. The way we consume carbon fuels, the way we consume so much, I think is on the verge of being challenged so significantly with the new technological advances. I mean, the old farmland that I lived in, not far from Mount Pleasant, Michigan, is now littered with giant windmills. It looks like some odyssey of some odyssey out of ancient Greece, but in a new perspective, and they're creating huge amounts of wind energy in these fields. We never considered that 30 or 40 years ago as a reality. And then we're now hearing about the Tesla electric cars and electric batteries and the new generation of solar. Things are changing rapidly, which further allow me the optimism to claim that we can be human earthworms, changing the planet for the better.
I love it. It's great. We just have to get people to admit that they actually poop.
Yeah, well, they do, don't they? And do all this stuff properly. There's all kinds of things. Right now, there's a man in Sweden who is becoming a good friend of mine, and he has been developing the waterless toilet. There's a little joke about how we use waste in most of the Western world and the westernized world, as opposed to the other parts of the world where they don't defecate into their drinking water. So there's two kinds of people, those that defecate in clean drinking water and those that don't. And by far, the vast majority of people in the world still do not defecate in their drinking water. And we in the West, in the United States, every time we flush the toilet, as you know, we use at least a gallon of clean, purified water to flush out our waste. And it goes into this abiotic system where we then try to treat our sewerage. And that's how we've developed our systems. But what if we were to completely revamp this and become living earthworms? It's revolutionary, it's game-changing, and it would mean a whole new infrastructure, but it really works. And it would really turn our populations into a whole different batch of people. And that would be living with nature. So I don't have the same type of qualms about our populations. It's just that we have to start living, as I say, in tune with nature like earthworms.
I love that. And okay, here's one quick question about the population, which I know people will ask me. What about our needs for all the resources we're using? You spoke a bit about energy, but say the computers that we're using right now have heavy metals in them, rare minerals, right, to make this computer work. And with so many people on the planet and the demand for those resources, when you think about that, do you still feel optimistic that we can turn things around?
One of the books which is kind of interesting to delve into is a book which was written a few years back called From Cradle to Cradle. And it was a message of recycling. And that message of recycling tells us that a lot of the waste that we are dumping into landfills today really should be recycled. Perhaps the new generation of economic power are the garbage dealers, because they'll be the ones who are literally mining these resources that we are now throwing away. And there's a certain tipping point where this becomes sustainable in the fact that it's economically sustainable. Right now, it makes sense ecologically, but it's not at the point where it's economically stimulating. Most of the arguments that we see about our environment today are propelled by economics, and economics don't necessarily jive with nature. To give you a good example, the debate on fossil fuels and the debate on renewable fuels, such as ethanol. In the United States, much of the ethanol is produced by growing corn. Now, when we look at the economics of it, you put in your fuel, you put in your tractors, you put in all the machinery, your investments in producing corn. And when you're producing ethanol at the energy level, you're actually putting in 1 unit of energy and getting out 1.2. That is a 20% rendition on your investment. When you look at countries like Brazil that are planting sugarcane to produce ethanol, they put in 1 unit of energy to plant the sugarcane, and they get out 8 units of energy in return. That is an 800% return on their investment when it comes to the fuel expended. In the United States, our use of food is also privy to this economic system, and it works because of the dollar value, but it doesn't work in terms of the nature value. Here's the nature value. We put in one energy unit, or we put in 10 energy units to get one energy unit of food on our table. That is completely ridiculous. This is the agro-industrial system that we're talking about. So the really funny thing is here is that because the dollar works, a system works that shouldn't work at all. Because if you were a natural farmer plowing and tilling and hoeing your soil, and you were putting in 10 energies to one energy harvested, you would die of starvation. But because economics is different than natural energy, our system works for the time being, although it's completely and illogically unsustainable. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. And so do you think that we have time to switch these systems around?
Well, take, for example, Joe Salatin. Joel's approach to farming is extraordinarily productive because what you pit against the agricultural perspective of the modern industrial agriculture complex is the fact that you put in very little and you get out a lot. What he puts in many ways, is intelligence and labor, but it produces a huge amount as an end result. And he may put in one amount and get out 30. So with agriculture, the reason agriculture works in the first place is because flowering plants are extremely productive in producing seeds, or in cases of tubers and stuff, they multiply and they produce lots of mass for the initial investment. Where all that other financial investment and energy expenditure comes from is the chains of distribution that we have created for moving food around. It doesn't cost 10 units of energy to produce the food in the field, Jill, but it's the subsequent transport, it's the subsequent packaging, it's the subsequent refrigeration, it's the subsequent movement from place to place that accumulates the energy load on 1 calorie of food. So it's the way we do things. So if we were to start doing things closer to home, then naturally we're going to reduce much of that energy expenditure, that waste of energy to get energy into our bodies, because this is what we're really talking about. So we're, again, looking at things, trying to create a more natural system that makes sense. So why does my approach to food plants differ from agro-industrial approaches to food plants? Well, part of the big subject today is crops and how we can adapt those crops to what they claim are ever-changing environments. So part of the big story then about the future of agriculture are these doomsayers who are convincing people of the need for relying on technology to solve the world's greatest problems. One of the perceived greatest problems of the world is food, and hence food security. So well-meaning people and conscious people are being affected by the media and by certain propagandists of what the future of food is. Climate change is something which seems very daunting, and it's scary to think of climate change. And after all, I mean, if the temperatures go up, sea levels rise, places get drier, some places get wetter, some places get colder, some places get hotter. Everything is in a tumultuous state. So doesn't it reason then, from the agro-industrial complex perspective, that we have to adapt our crops to these ever-changing environments? And the way we're going to do this is we're going to take the crops that we rely on, and we're going to technologically adapt them to these daunting environments. It sounds perfect, and anyone within a certain reasonable sense should say it makes sense. I mean, don't we all want to be able to produce corn, especially in an ever-changing climatic world, in hotter places and drier places and wetter places? Of course we do. And so what they're telling us is that technology can rush to the rescue. What they're not telling us is that they themselves are already extraordinarily myopic. And I think this was, you breached this subject in the beginning when you said the specialization that we're seeing in the world, the academic specialization and the corporate and industrial specialization demanded of engineers, demanded of scientists, has necessarily reduced their perspective of the bigger picture. If you become an agro-industrial engineer and you become a corn scientist, inevitably your work is going to be on a microcosm within the genre of corn, where you may study as few as a few alleles of genetics of corn. So that's really bizarre that you become so specialized. So if you are asked the question, how are we going to solve the world's food problems in a changing environment, your basic response is going to be limited. And I take this riskily, that corn is the answer. And the only way to make the answer of corn better is to make corn better and more resilient to these ever-changing conditions. First of all, this type of myopia is top-heavy in the sense that where the scientist is, where the industry is, where agriculture is at the point that they themselves are in their industrial complex. They've done this research on corn up to here, and their departure point is always going to be from that area there. So they're limited in their perspective. They don't see the broad horizon of food plant reality, and this is where I come in and I shatter all the myths. The first myth is we already have plants. Going back to my scenario described and part of my passion of discovering these all over the world, we have plants that have grown for thousands, if not millions of years, all over the planet in vastly different ecological zones. So if we take the desert dwellers of the Kalahari, the San people, and we follow them around for a day, and we find what they harvest in nature, we already have clues for the food plants of the future for similitude habitats all over the world that could be put into cultivation or at least into tended nature and produce huge quantities of food. Now, the agro-industrial complex doesn't necessarily have any inspiration to do something like this because, first of all, at the very base, you have R&D. And who wants to put R&D into something that's not proven? It is proven, as I would argue, because they've already been feeding people for thousands of years. They are valuable in their food plant characteristics. They're valuable in their nutritional profiles, and they grow in areas that we're only dreaming that we can make corn grow in. So rather than adapt the plant to the environment, why don't we take plants that are already adapted to the environment? Seems to be quite a simple solution, doesn't it? So not having a huge number of plants to contend with. I mean, the corn scientists deal with corn. The wheat scientists deal with wheat. They're dealing with basically a small little perspective of the big, huge food issue. And that is they don't know the rest of the picture. I often mention a woman by the name of Nina Fedorov when I talk about the genetic modified organism debate. Nina Fedorov is an academician, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a woman who I tell in speeches has been a science advisor to two secretaries of states, I think Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton. And she will stand before a group of reporters and she'll tell them that the only way we are going to feed a hungry world is if we depend upon genetically modified organisms. Now, in a certain sense, I agree with her, but the distinction is that I am suggesting that we look at plants that have been growing in the appropriate environments and we adapt them to that are growing in the appropriate environments and that we use them in similitude environments around the world. So in a certain sense, I would like to see them genetically modified through selection, through horticulture, through some type of means of fast tracking, in many cases, their domestication. So that is some type of genetic modification. But it's not exactly what Nina Fedorov is talking about. She is talking about taking the genes, maybe inserting or splicing or doing something else to rapidly accelerate this, and thereby fiddling with nature itself in what others have come to call Frankenscience. What does it mean when we take corn and we insert a bacteria gene into the corn? Part of the story about the decline of certain Lepidoptera being attributed, at least by some of the thinking community, and realize I haven't said scientific community, I'm saying thinking community, because sometimes scientists don't seem to see evidence as it's clearly depicted, is that corn has been genetically modified to include a toxic bacteria in its genes, or a part of the toxic bacteria in its genes. And this was, in effect, a way of making it resistant to the army cutworm. Army cutworm is a Lepidoptera, a moth larva, which is extremely susceptible to the toxins of Bacillus thuringiensis. So when they installed the genes that are responsible for the toxicity of the bacteria into corn, they essentially made corn a lepidtoxin, able to kill Lepidoptera and other insects which are susceptible to its toxins. What that means is not clear, except the thinking mind would say, well, if the whole plant is toxic, maybe its pollen could kill caterpillars. Maybe it could kill the larva of the monarch. Maybe it could kill the larva of so many of our butterflies. Talking about that, I just recently this summer drove across the United States, actually several times across the United States. And from the memories of my childhood back in the 70s to today, there is an extraordinary difference, and I'll tell you what it is. I used to get out as a kid and look at the front grill of our car, of our family station wagon, and I would be the ardent and budding entomologist because I'd pick all the dead butterflies off the grill. That was back in the 70s, and I remember it vividly, sometimes getting out and filling a little cigar box with dead butterfly specimens just after one gas fill-up. Well, I drove back and forth across the United States this year, and to my chagrin, I only saw a few dead butterflies on my grill. It was almost non-existent, as if the butterflies had disappeared. At that point, with all these waves, amber waves of grain, of these genetically modified grains, and especially the ones that I referred to as the butterfly toxin ones, isn't it possible that we have killed off butterflies by some insane science experiment that has gone way beyond the realm of just controlling one pest, the army cutworm, and in fact has decimated populations of butterflies across the entire plain states where corn is a major crop? So these type of results really need to be considered in their natural significance. Are humans more dangerous because they dig up soil, or are humans more dangerous because they tinker with the genes of life itself? These are the things that have to be answered. And I think that the engineering perspective of life and inserting genes that we don't know what the effects are still too dubious to practice on a large level.
Oh, it takes us, what it does too, it makes me think of the specialization versus the generalist, because the specialist is thinking, I'll put this gene in the corn, it will have this effect, and doesn't think of the unintended consequences.
Oh, and that's very much the case. And that's part of the problem of our modern industrial agriculture complex, is that we have necessarily invited crops to become buffets for specific pest and host relationships. And so what we've done is we've created giant smorgasbords for insects by planting thousands and thousands and thousands of acres, even millions of acres of the same crop, making them extremely vulnerable to certain specific pests. And in this case of corn, the army cutworm. We invited the pest to come because that's all we are growing. If we were to have a great diversity, we get to the homeostasis of nature. And I'll point that out by giving the example of the forest. Very few people have I ever heard make comment of, oh, all the pests in that forest. Now, it has happened on occasion that there is the army tentworm, which seems to be covering every tree in certain eastern states. But for the most part, people don't look at a forest and worry about insect pests because we don't consider pest pressure to be great when there is botanical diversity, because we don't notice the effects. As I've said, there are cases where we've had, army cutworms that seem to eat, or not army cutworms, but tentworms that seem to eat every tree in the forest. But this is extremely rare. The diversity of plants, their chemical makeups, the type of host relationships they have with different insects necessarily mandates that nature is in balance. When that balance is tipped over because of man's monocultures, we see a much different effect. By the same token, we are looking at herbicides. And one of the things that's amazing about Roundup is it's now coming clear that nature always survives. And it survives by changing and adapting. And that even happens at the genetic level. And plants are becoming resistant to the herbicides that they have been sprayed with. That is a part of natural selection. So by dumping on chemicals and having a one-stop system, we're essentially creating havoc in nature. And this is what the grand industrialists have not considered because, like you say, they look at a problem, they think of it mechanistically, and they don't realize that cockroaches have been around for millions of years and have continued to adapt and change in order to survive. We try to eradicate them, but they always come back because they are resilient. So when we look at nature, we have to consider ourselves a part of nature, not above it, and not all powerful, but in fact, always at its whim and fancy. And human beings happen to be that because we know the effects of our toxic chemicals that we're applying on our crops comes back to us and affects us biologically as well. So we don't escape it. We're not at the end of a food chain. We're not at the beginning of it. We're encircled in it.
Mm-hmm. And so, Joseph, you are out exploring. You are finding new species of plants or new old species. You're reintroducing plant species. So you were talking about adapted plants. So these plants that can grow in maybe dry, extreme conditions. Yes. And instead of taking the genes of that plant and inserting them into one of our food crops that we use, I think you're advocating for growing those plants in the similar environment where it came from. So can you talk a bit about the usefulness of these plants in some of the climate change conditions that we're facing?
Okay, this is a great topic, and I'll start by introducing the work of a friend of mine. His name is Richard Felger. So Richard Felger is an ethnobotanist. He's written a great number of treatises on the Seri Indians and on the desert Southwest. He at once ran the Desert Institute, which was an institute dedicated to food production in the desert. So Richard Felger's life work, among many of his botanical conquests, is to reintegrate foodways of the past into our modern food systems. And what he's been looking at is the deserts. He's been looking at the dry, arid regions of the American Southwest and of the northwestern Mexican regions. And he's come up with the realization that many of the plants that grew in those areas produced huge amounts of food, but because of the ignorance of the settlers, because of the ignorance of the colonialists who were moving these traditional people's ways out of the way, much of this was forgotten. And so what has happened is that they've fallen into complete obscurity, things that were very valuable for feeding people. And this is just a part of the monovision of our society and the way we organize, the way we do things. Now I'll stop there for a second because there's going to be another little clip which is relevant. And that is certain things stuck when the colonialists came to North America. Tobacco, for example, was so impressive that it found its way to Europe. Corn was so impressive that it found its way to Europe. Squash were so impressive that they found their way to Europe. But many of the things were so obscure, were not necessarily immediately appreciated, and were suppressed or pushed out of the way. So in North America, some 3,000 to 4,000 plant species were used by the indigenous peoples. As the settlers spread westward, they were like a giant tide bringing their own culture with them, oblivious to what was used or what was valued in the past by the native people, and many times just suppressed because they were fighting and they were chasing them off their land. So it was in a type of most nonsensical obliteration of tradition. You have ignorant settlers moving in with their own preconceptions about how life should be and what they would bring with them, including the whole host of domesticated animals that they brought. Remember, there weren't horses on the North American continent or the South American continent until the Europeans brought them. They came via maybe Genghis Khan to Europe, and then they made their way to North and South America with the conquistadors. So those were introduced domestic animals. The large mammal of North America was the buffalo. It was the sustenance of the entire central region, and it was the sustenance of life in terms of animal food. So it turns out that the settlers then, moving across the American continent, pushed out indigenous people and obliterated their foodways. that means that they could have had some very good things to eat had they been more attentive to what was being eaten. But because they weren't, it was obliterated. So now we have this huge continent that varies from the northwest being typically very wet to the northeast typically being very moist, down to the southeast, which is very moist, all the way to the southwest, which is extremely dry, with variations of those things in between. And all the plants that grew in all those regions were useful for cultivation. In fact, many of them are and continue to be tend to nature. We can imagine in the Northeast when Yule Gibbons wrote the book In Pursuit of the Wild Asparagus. It was because asparagus grew wild all over the place, and it was a revered food source in the early spring. And so people continued that tradition. Many of the traditions fell out and they were no longer used. So when we talk about the desert and about using plants from the desert, hundreds and hundreds of plants were used in the desert and produced everything from fruit. Think of all the cacti, the big, beautiful, prickly pears, the saguaros with their gorgeous fruits that split open to reveal berry-like flesh. Those were fruits and foods that were used by indigenous peoples that are not used today. So can we grow those instead of planting fields of corn in arid regions and irrigating the hell out of them? Of course we can, but it would take a new perspective. So when I start telling people that there are hundreds or thousands of plants to grow in deserts, I take into consideration what types of foods I'm talking about, whether it's vegetables, whether it's fruits, whether it's roots, whether it's tubers or grains. And I realize that I have such an arsenal of plants that what I'm saying is not only real, but urgent. We don't need to grow corn in the desert. We don't need to grow Bibb lettuce in Yuma, California in the winter months because it's a more moderate temperature in the winter instead of the summer when it gets up to 120 degrees and they irrigate. And so we can grow crops there that are adapted naturally to those environs.
Now, I think the concern with that some people have is that the crops that we've domesticated and we kind of baby them, and in return they give us sweet, yummy produce. What is the taste and flavor? And I know this is a huge, I mean, it's a huge generalization, but is the taste and flavor of these wild foods as delicious as the crops that we have had a long relationship with?
Absolutely. I'll give you a couple examples that are pertinent. And I think I may have even mentioned these in the past with you because they're so phenomenal. There's a book which is called The Food Plants of the Rocky Mountains. And in this book, a couple professors from, I believe, the University of Colorado wrote an excerpt on Ipomoea leptophylla, which is known colloquially as the manroot. It turns out that these people had eaten a couple young manroot tubers. It's related to the sweet potato, and they reckon that it was even better tasting than a sweet potato. So from the standpoint of palatability, from the standpoint of nutrition, we're right on par. And yet this is a plant that has never been cropped. No one, to my knowledge, has ever tried to domesticate it, and it stands preeminently ready for man to tend it. That's amazing. Another plant which I was reminded of its value and its forgottenness was up in northeastern Wyoming last year. I drove something like 1,000 miles in pursuit of what is known as the prairie turnip or the Indian turnip. The scientific name is Pediomelum esculentum, and for hundreds, if not thousands of years, the prairie Indians in the north central states would harvest these during the early spring when the plant would flower, because that's when it was so eminently visible with the blue flower, kind of like a lupine, growing in the prairie. So when I got up to northeastern Wyoming, it was already towards the cusp of the season, and the plants had desiccated, dried up, and shriveled up. And it took me several days before I found my first specimen. But when I got out in the Arapaho grasslands, I was walking around in the grasslands and I saw this little shriveled up plant that couldn't have been much more than 4 inches tall. I started digging in the rock hard clay. I was digging, and I had a little utensil, and I was digging the first plant up, pull up a tuber which was probably about 2 inches long to maybe 3 inches long and about 1 inch wide. So that was the first one I had ever dug up. So I had already accomplished my goal of that I drove 1,000 miles to get to. But I thought, okay, I'll see if I can find another one. So within another 5 minutes, I had located another plant and dug up another tuber. So at that point, I'm becoming more confident. And I said, well, I'll spend a few more minutes here and see if I can find some more. So within another 10, 15 minutes, I had about 10 of the tubers. And within an hour, I had about 25 or 30 of the tubers. So the question, how did it taste? It had a very thick skin on it, say maybe a millimeter thick, which meant when you finally started opening it up, you could peel the entire skin off the tuber in one pull. And what it revealed beneath was a snow white, fleshy tuber. And you got to listen to the rest here. This is why the Indians treasured these things. It tasted like a coconut and like a green bean and like a potato all in one. Crunchy, sweet, and delicious. This thing is growing in nature. Nobody is planting it. Nobody is taking care of it. And it is a resource that even little old me, inexperienced me at this point, was able to harvest 25 of them, which would have been plenty sufficient for a meal for 2 or 3 people. And the worst time of year to harvest it, the plants are dried up and almost invisible. And yet I was able to procure this food in a small area for myself. Now imagine in the day when these indigenous people knew how to harvest them, how many of these tubers they could harvest and what a wonderful food resource it was. But also consider that this is growing in non-agricultural land, in dry grasslands, in thick marl clay. I mean, when it dries up, it is almost as hard as a rock. I mean, I had a chip of this, and this plant is growing there. It's a perennial, and yet no agricultural innovation has been applied to this most beautiful natural resource, the Indian turnip. Why? Why has no one taken any interest in this already super resilient plant to grow it as a crop? It's obviously delicious. It's obviously nutritious. It obviously is resilient. It grows in a tough area where corn won't even grow. I mean, what kind of corn would grow in thick marl clay? Come on, everyone. This is an extraordinary resource. Going south, I'll take you to West Texas. In West Texas and also southern New Mexico and southern Arizona, there is a plant known as Pediomelum, Peniocereus gregii. That is the queen of the night. It's a beautiful cactus flower. It has a huge dinner plate size flower in some cases, but it grows on a spindly stemmed cactus that produces an edible tuber that, listen carefully, gets up to 80 pounds.
Oh,
Now,
wow.
the Pima Indians and the indigenous people of West Texas and of northern Sonora and Chihuahua would harvest these tubers. I myself have harvested one. I took it back to Michigan. I boiled it up in a pot, and it was delicious. And we're talking about a tuber crop that will grow in areas where the soil temperature on the surface gets up to 160 degrees. No irrigation needed, and we're able to grow a crop. And what is even more exciting about this plant is it produces a beautiful red fruit that tastes kind of like a raspberry, mandarin, prickly pear fruit with little tiny digestible seeds. And no one's growing it as a crop. Why is that happening?
Wow. Wow. So this is really fascinating information for people because these are foods that I would think no one has heard of.
Well, okay, so to this extent, we are trying to organize at this very moment a conference which we are nominating the North American Food Plant Renaissance. And part of the discussions will be to examine what this great continent offers for the future of food. All these thousands of plants that I mentioned that the indigenous people used to eat that have now been forgotten or fallen by the wayside need to be reconsidered because in our proper environments, they could be the source of the next generation of food plants.
So these plants, Joseph, are just incredible. And is there any other plant you would want to share with our listeners today?
You know, I just mentioned tubers, but there are, for example, when I started speaking about Richard Felger, he has been working on 2 grains that are ready to go into commercial production that we've already eaten. We've already done laboratory analyses on. So these 2 grains that we're talking about are extremely promising because they were natural grains that were essentially driven off of their lands because when the cattlemen came through and all of this grazing took place, many of these grains were decimated because of the heavy grazing that was done on Western lands. So some of the grains almost went extinct. And so by reviewing the literature, by studying the historical locations where these plants grew, Dr. Felger was able to collect samples of the seeds, and he started a project many years ago to see if this had economic potential as well as nutritional potential. So what he realized after working with these grains for a number of years is that they produce huge quantities of grain, very palatable grains. In fact, I was able to enjoy the baking of these grains. This last summer, I went to Richard's house, and a neighbor had produced some muffins and some scones using the flour from these two grains. And I must admit, they were delicious, extraordinarily well made. The nutritional profile of these grains rivals quinoa, or rivals teff, or rivals any of the noble grains that we're so familiar with that are now coming into the market as superfoods. And so what we're seeing here is a native grain that was all but forgotten. In fact, in some cases was endangered because of habitat destruction, that is now being proposed to certain grain producing companies through me and through Dr. Felger to revitalize the grain production in the American Southwest, which is in many years water compromised, having very insignificant rainfall, and utilizing a natural plant species adapted to the specific environment. This is wonderful, wonderful news.
Do you want to share the name of it or not yet?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. That's a part of our research secret because we put in years of research to it. But it is extremely exciting, and soon the entire world will know about it.
That is fabulous. So Joseph, you have been working with plants since you were a child, and I think for your 7th birthday, you actually asked for a squash. Is that true?
Yeah, that was true. My father had introduced squash to me through an old timer, an old miner who lived along a creek in Manitou Springs, Colorado. And I went to his house, and he had a whole pile of squash in his house. And I think I must have been about 6 years old. I had already been interested in them. But at that point, I was so determined that I wanted to collect squash that I told my mom and dad, I said, look, for my 7th birthday, I want squash. And so my mom looked at my dad and they said, well, we'll get you squash. So it turns out for my birthday party, I had a Hubbard squash, an acorn squash, some butternut squash, a banana squash, and I was the happiest little kid in the world. And I have a photo from the family archives to prove it. And it's actually on my website, I think.
That is so great. So that was kind of an omen of what was to come.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so what is it? So you've been working with plants for many, many years. What is it that keeps, and I think people can gather that from this interview, but what is it that keeps you traveling and going back for more?
Well, a couple of days ago, I pulled off something and just off the internet saying that there are certain people with genetic traits towards being wanderers and discoverers. And I think that's me by nature. And I think my dad was the same way because like I travel all over the world, my father traveled all over the United States. And in the past, when I told people I went to 20 schools before high school, they would say, well, was your father in the military? I said, no, he was a house painter, but he loved to travel. And I just took it to the next notch. But it's about being curious. I often tell people that I'm like Curious George, that I never get enough of things. And the passion of discovery is what fuels me. But apparently the field is a pretty good one because no matter how many plants I study, no matter how many I've eaten, there's always something new to discover. Right now, I'm imagining that there's a blue jean, blue carrot growing somewhere in Afghanistan. I'm imagining that there is a pure white watermelon growing in the Sudan. I'm imagining that there's some cactus plant in central Mexico that has a giant fruit that tastes like a strawberry. These are all things that I kind of know about and that I keep yearning for. And it seems that these dreams are coming true.
Wow, that's so great. I mean, it's so wonderful that you are able to pursue these plants, find them, and then bring them back to us and educate us about them. If someone is listening right now and they know of some amazing plants they'd like to share with you, how can people find you online?
Please, okay, this would be really relevant. I'm going to tell you something that's happening today. An Ethiopian immigrant who came from Ethiopia many, many years ago, has been growing a plant that I have been searching for over 12 years. It's called achote. And this gentleman found out about me, wrote me an email and said, sir, I would be very happy if you would come and visit me because I have been growing achote and I heard that you like unusual plants. And it was like my heart just started to flutter because you have to imagine 12 years has gone into me searching out this. I actually was in Ethiopia, and because of situations of our travel, was not able to get to Oromia, where the plant comes from. And I get this obscure email from this gentleman telling me that he's been growing the plant for a couple of decades here in the United States. So in the next few days, I hope to have a visit, and I hope to procure propagation material of this plant because the tuber, it's a squash family member. And it happens that the tuber is eaten like a potato, the fruit is eaten like a fruit, and the leaves are eaten like a spinach. So it is an amazing plant that is all but unknown. It's called achote. So for people who have these little treasures, you can get a hold of me at my email, Simcox, SIMCOX, 2, at mac.com. And of course, another way is to go to my website, which is explorewithjoseph.com.
It's a great website too.
Well, thank you very much. And Jill, I mean, it's always a pleasure. I mean, I know every time we start these conversations, we open up the world, but I certainly look forward to working with you again. And I love what you're doing, getting these messages out to people because it's so wonderful to share information. And in the process, we all learn and we all connect with like-minded individuals who have a better vision for our planet and for humanity.
Oh, well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. For more information or to hear our other podcasts or interviews, visit www.sustainableworldradio.com. Sustainable World Radio is produced by Jill Cloutier. Music by Dana Lyons. Thanks for listening.